Welcome to the Israel Insider Weekly Podcast, where we talk about the news in Israel with Ron Cantor, president of Shalanu TV and Israel Regional Director for God TV. I'm Lisa Hutchison. Thanks for joining us today. Well, Ron, it seems this week's hot topic is something pretty cool. Ice cream. Had to be a little punny there to start things off, but yeah, ice cream. Ben & Jerry's has made a big announcement this week. How about fill our listeners in on what's happening?
Well, after coming under tremendous pressure from the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, otherwise known as the BDS movement, Ben & Jerry's, and Ben & Jerry's has always been a super liberal group, even though I think the original Ben & Jerry were Jewish. They're hippie, far left-wing Jews, not necessarily pro-Israel. But the company that bought them, Unilever, announced this week that they were going to stop selling Ben & Jerry's ice cream in East Jerusalem in the West Bank. So we know that is biblical Judea and Samaria. And this will take effect at the end of 2022. So we're still 18 months away, but that has been in the news every day, all day in Israel, on the podcast, on the television nightly news. Everyone is talking about this. And it's not because Ben & Jerry's is so popular in Israel and people are fretting. It is because that they are a world brand and they are making a political statement that many Israelis see this, many people see this as an anti-Semitic act. The U.S. government sees this as an anti-Semitic act, that you're punishing the entire nation of Israel because you don't like certain policies. So,
politics has invaded ice cream. That's pretty bad.
Yeah. Well, like the CEO of Ben & Jerry's in Israel said that, politics and ice cream should never mix. And,
that's right.
He's very concerned. Understandably so. So to quote Prime Minister Bennett, he said the decision is morally wrong, and I believe it will become clear that it is also commercially wrong. The boycott against Israel, a democracy surrounded by islands of terrorism. Now, I don't know if Ben & Jerry's is popular in Iran or in Saudi Arabia, where there is real oppression and persecution, where people are killed for their faith or their lack of faith if they're not a good enough Muslim, where people can't dance, where women can't drive. I don't know if
some of the names of Ben & Jerry's ice creams, I can't even imagine them being allowed in those countries. It's anyways, who knows if it's there in these islands of terrorism, but it's there in Israel. Well, at least for now.
It's probably going to backfire. I don't see this working out well for Ben & Jerry's. Fortunately, Israel still has a lot of friends in this world, particularly in America, where Ben & Jerry's was born. 35 states, several states in America. Lapid and Erdogan, who is our ambassador to America, sent a letter to the governors of 35 states calling them to action. And many of the states in America, they have laws against the BDS movement, against punishing Israel economically, against boycotting Israel. In fact, Texas is right now, they are looking into whether or not they should blacklist Ben & Jerry's, not just Ben & Jerry's, but Unilever, their parent company. Well, let me just read from our article. It says Texas, the largest state, is considering blacklisting Ben & Jerry's. And again, it's not just Ben & Jerry's, it's their parent company, Unilever, as well, which has tons of different products that we see every day. As this goes against a government code. Again, this isn't even a matter of Texas saying, hey, we're pro-Israel. It's a law in Texas that prohibits them from doing business with companies that boycott Israel. So this is again, everyone's talking about this, and it is because Ben & Jerry's is a big name, but it's also because of the consequence that when a company decides that they're not going to do business with Israel, because they're being pressured from an anti-Semitic group, the BDS group. What does this mean long term for Israel?
So with that, how is it in Israel? Like with the like on the ground, are people stopping buying Ben and Jerry's, or how are they? What's the reaction
it's
there?
really interesting because there are three different entities here. There is Ben and Jerry's Israel. There is Unilever, which gives the license to Ben and Jerry's Israel to operate. And then there is the original Ben and Jerry's. Now, let me explain this because it's really important, because all three of them have different views. So you've got Ben and Jerry's Israel, which is like, no way, this is wrong. They're giving jobs to thousands of Israelis, and they're I mean, again, this guy's saying this is not what we should be doing. They want to be selling ice cream in the West Bank. They want to be selling ice cream in Israeli cities in Judea and Samaria. So actually, Ben and Jerry's in Israel is up 22%. People are buying it because they're not when they buy it, they're not supporting Ben and Jerry's, the original Ben and Jerry's, and they're not supporting the company that bought Ben and Jerry's, Unilever. They're supporting Israelis. So they're actually up. So if you want to boycott, don't boycott Ben and Jerry's inside of Israel. That's hurting Israel.
Yeah.
If you want to boycott internet, and I imagine most of our listeners are not in Israel. So I personally, now I'm not a big ice cream eater, but I will not be buying Ben and Jerry's, and I will be looking at all the different products that Unilever uses, and I'll stop using them. And let me just say this, Lisa, I'm not a big fan of the boycott. A long time ago, I realized that if I boycott every company that I have disagreements with, I won't be able to buy anything, because at a certain point, you got to be able to put gas in your car. You got to be able to eat, and it just I'm not a fan of the boycott. However, I am a fan of the counter boycott. In other words, if you're going to boycott my country, well, then we're going to boycott you. And so my encouragement to all of our listeners is to go to Google Unilever products. That's Unilever. Find out everything they sell, and then go on Facebook, go on Twitter, and say you will not be doing business with those companies anymore. That is going to have a profound impact. If every pro-Israel evangelical Christian Zionist goes to social media and makes a statement, they're going to reverse this decision pretty quickly. Now, there is another wrinkle in this story, and here is the wrinkle. So, again, to be clear, Ben and Jerry's is not saying, and again, let me be clear, Unilever, the parent company that owns Ben and Jerry's, is not saying that they're no longer going to do business inside of Israel. They're saying they're no longer going to do business in the what we call disputed territories. The disputed territories are the lands that we captured in the 6-Day War. Now, I don't want to go into all the history and politics. We have this elsewhere on our site. But we got those lands because we were about to be attacked in 1967 by Egypt, by Syria. Have you seen Syria lately? And by Jordan. They were going to attack us. And the goal of that attack, Lisa, was to destroy Israel as a nation completely, not just to win a war, to get a little bit of land back. Because again, at that point, the land that people are fighting over today, we didn't have. When they say, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was created before we had East Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, when we were a sliver of what we are now. Now, we're already just a sliver, but we were even much smaller. And so when you got to ask yourself, what Palestine did they want to liberate? It wasn't, the Judea, Samaria. It wasn't the West Bank. It wasn't Gaza. It was Tel Aviv. It was Jerusalem. It was the half of Jerusalem we have. It was Haifa. They wanted to destroy Israel and kill every Jew. And so as a result, there was the 6-Day War, which, to the shock of the entire world, we won in 6 days. We took the Golan Heights. We took the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. And so for our own security, we allowed Jewish people to have cities. Now, again, it's not in a huge part of the West Bank. It's a vast area. But inside the West Bank, the media loves to call them settlements, like that's an evil word. What is a settlement? A settlement is just a city that happens to be in an area that you're not happy about. Suddenly it becomes a settlement. And so it's only in those areas, Unilever's saying, is that, it's just in those areas where we're not going to be selling, but we're going to be selling in Israel. Now, Ben & Jerry's, the original Ben & Jerry's board, and they had an agreement apparently with Unilever that there would be no radical decisions unless the independent board, again, this was an agreement when they sold the company to them, that this independent board would have authority over this decision. So they're saying, no, we want to be out of Israel completely. So again, Ben & Jerry's is, the original Ben & Jerry's and their original board. They're very left wing. They're very, and again, I believe in social justice. I do believe in that. I want social justice for everyone. But they're radical social justice warriors, and they hate the Jewish nation, and they want Ben & Jerry's completely out. So again, Ben & Jerry's, the original board, let's just be clear, the independent board that represents the original Ben & Jerry's, they're siding with Hamas.
Wow.
They're siding with the PLO. They're saying that Israel is illegitimate as a nation completely. If they're saying that they don't want to be in Israel at all, they're saying there should be no Jews whatsoever in the nation of Israel, and it shouldn't be called Israel. I imagine they would say it should be called Palestine. But the fact is, and we share this all the time, there has never been a nation called Palestine, and there is a nation called Israel that goes all the way back to the time when Moses led the children of Israel up out of Egypt, and they settled the land of Israel. Eventually became Israel and Judah, and we could go through all the history. But the fact is, there is an Israeli history in the land of Israel. There is no Palestinian history.
Have you heard of Shalanu TV? It's the only 24/7 Hebrew language gospel channel, and we are reaching tens of thousands of Israelis. Learn more at shalanunow.com. That's shalanunow.com.
Foreign Minister Yair Lapid last week made a short but impactful speech to the Global Forum Against Anti-Semitism. And in there, he started, I think, an interesting, perhaps it will, have momentum, who knows, but an interesting dialogue about what is anti-Semitism. And he proposed reframing it, which I think caused quite a stir there, especially former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu weighed in on it. So maybe you could enlighten us about that and what all that was about.
Right. So let me just read a little bit of his speech. The anti-Semites weren't only in Budapest ghetto, but the anti-Semites were also the slave traders who threw people bound together in chains into the sea. Anti-Semites were the extremist Hutu in Rwanda who massacred the Tutsis. He said that they were the Muslim fanatics who kill gay people. And I think you understand what in other words, he's saying that all racism is anti-Semitism. And this drew a little bit of pushback, particularly, now right now, former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he's pretty much spending his time doing everything he can to bring down the government. So he is monitoring everything. He's calling the CEO of Pfizer, even though he's not the prime minister anymore. He attacked this, that you cannot say all racism is equal to anti-Semitism. And this brings, and I would agree with him. Now, let's look at the two men. You've got Benjamin Netanyahu is not religious, but he is what would I call traditional. He is very respectful of Judaism, of the Jewish religion. And so is Yair Lapid, but in a much more secular way. Lapid is much more liberal when it comes to, the idea of the Jewish people being chosen. I believe that, Reform Judaism is not big in Israel. Now, what is Reform Judaism? Well, in a Reform synagogue, you might have, the rabbi could be a lesbian woman. That's how progressive it is. So that style of Judaism, and I know many many of my parents' friends and people I grew up with, that's their type of Judaism, which is pretty much, we love being Jewish, we love our culture, but we don't really know about God so much. It doesn't mean that they're atheists. Maybe they are atheists, but they know for some reason, they know it's important to continue to maintain their Jewish identity. But then you've got people like Benjamin Netanyahu who are more traditional, and he seized on those comments, calling them outrageous and irresponsible. And I understand both of them. And I think that they're both wrong. I think that both of them are wrong, because so here's where I would disagree with Lapid. Anti-Semitism is specifically Jewish, and it's been around for thousands of years. There have been 52 attempted genocides against the Jewish people.
Wow.
We can talk about Saddam Hussein. We can talk about Hitler. We can go back to Haman. There is something very demonic. And when I say demonic, I mean that the enemy of the Jewish people, the enemy of God, has a diabolical plan to destroy the Jewish people. This is different from racism against Black people. It's different from racism or any type of hatred against homosexuals, against Muslims, against people from other countries. It is very different because it's connected to God. It's an all-out assault against God. And it would take somebody who really doesn't have a strong faith in God to just say, hey, we're all together. Now, this has been the sin of Israel for a long, long time. Let's go all the way back to, the time of Samuel, when the Jewish people said, we just want to be like everybody else. We give us a king. We want a king. We want to be like the other nations. Now, that was very much pre-Holocaust Europe was a lot like that. You had Jewish people all over Europe who maybe they were Jewish at home, but in the street they were Russian or Polish or, Austrian. They didn't want to be known in their job as the Jewish guy. They just wanted to be like everybody else. And as we all know, that didn't work out. And so when you lump in anti-Semitism with all other forms of hatred, in some way you're denying God. You're denying the history of God, the history and the story going all the way back to Adam until now, where he called Abraham, raised up a people that would be a blessing to the whole world. And the enemy has sought, whether it was theologically or through violence or through boycotts, to turn the world against the Jewish people. There are Ben and Jerry's, as far as I know, they're not boycotting China, who oppresses and kills people every day. They're not boycotting Russia, who took over parts of Ukraine. I don't think they are. I don't know this for a fact, but I'm pretty sure they're not. They're selectively choosing because it's cool to boycott Israel, at least in left-wing circles. So let's not, I think it's a huge mistake to lump in violent anti-Semitism with every other type of hatred. Now, on the other hand, here's where, we get it wrong. Because right now, we do have an extremist segment, if you will, in our society in Israel. And like in America, they've kind of come out of the closet in recent years. And these are extreme radical religious Jews. Now, when I say radical religious, I don't mean Al-Qaeda radical religious, and I don't mean ISIS radical religious, but in that kivun, we say in Hebrew, in that direction. In other words, they're not blowing up, mosque, and they're not murdering, Muslims, cutting off their heads, like ISIS did to non-Muslims and Muslims alike. But they are racist, and they do have a sense of Jewish supremacy, if you will. And it goes back to being, hey, we're God's chosen people. God is with us, which means he's not with you. And again, I want to be so clear to our listeners. This is not the majority of Israel. It's a tiny segment of our population. Now, I would say that probably half of Israel does have a certain sense of ethnic pride. and just like Italians do, just like Irish folks do. I mean, that's okay. Not all ethnic pride is right. You like the fact that you have a unique culture. God created all the nations of the world, and maybe pride is not the best word, but patriotism. But you take it too far when you begin to look down on others. And that's, I think, what Lapid's trying to get at. He's trying to say that we're not better than anybody else. But you don't do that by saying that anti-Semitism isn't specific and different from other types of racism. Now, let me say this. The calling on the Jewish people, we are Am Nivcha. That means the chosen people. The question is, chosen for what? It goes back to the disciples fighting over who's going to be number one, who's going to be number two, who's going to sit on the right, who's going to sit on the left. That is not God's idea of leadership. That's not God's idea of chosenness. So the Jewish people, yes, we are the chosen people. Chosen to what? To serve the nations, to bless the nations. By the way, that's why Israel, even in unbelief, continues to far surpassing any other nation in the world, any other group of people. We have breakthroughs in technology, in the medical industry, in agriculture. That's the chosenness, because those technologies then go all over the world to bless people. That's kind of the icing on the cake, if you will. But the cake, the thing that we were chosen to do, was to bless the nations by giving them Yeshua, by birthing the Messiah, which came through a Jewish woman born into a Jewish culture, a Jewish nation, even though we were under Roman control at the time. And then it was the Jewish apostles that took this message of Messiah to the nations. So if we are going to glory, if you will, in our chosenness, it has to be under the or with the understanding that we're chosen to serve, to humble ourselves. I always go back to, Paul in Philippians chapter 2, where he explains New Testament leadership, in New Testament humility, and that is looking out for other people, looking to the interest of others above yourself. That is what it means to be humble in the New Testament. Not always thinking about yourself, how can I advance my own cause, but how can I serve and help other people? So to the degree that Israel is chosen, to that degree, we need to serve other nations.
If you're enjoying the Israel Insider podcast, make sure to sign up for the Israel Insider Daily Mail with news from the Holy Land at join.theisraelinsider.com. That's join.theisraelinsider.com.
One other, in what Yair Lapid was talking about, and Benjamin Netanyahu, and you sharing about how there are different, not factions, but parts, sections of Judaism. It seemed like there was a clash between those. If you maybe want to just touch on that briefly, the day of mourning and fasting, Tisha B'Av, was this past weekend, and it got a little ugly on the Western Wall and then up on the Temple Mount.
Yeah, I don't want to take too much time because I know we've gone on for a while, but folks can certainly read about it. It's one of our articles this week. So real quickly, there is a section in the Western Wall that is called the Egalitarian Section. And this has been in debate for years because the Rabbanut, which is Orthodox Judaism in Israel, has control over a lot of institutions like marriage, like Judaism, like synagogues. And so the Western Wall is considered a synagogue. And for years, other forms of Judaism, conservative and reform. Again, reform is very liberal. Conservative is more or less in the middle. I grew up in a conservative synagogue, and they wanted their own place. They wanted a place where men and women could worship together, could pray together. By the way, which is like we do in most, New Testament congregations, evangelical churches. You don't have a section for men and women. In Orthodox Judaism, you do not have men and women together. And so this has been in debate because even though it's only a very small number of Orthodox Jews that have control, they do have the control legally. And so finally, the Supreme Court finally said, no, you got to cater to other forms of Judaism. And so, and they've never actually built it, and they will in the future, supposedly. But in the meantime, there is an area at the Western Wall that is for men and women to worship together, and for other forms of Judaism, conservative reform, to do bar mitzvahs and other type of ceremonies there. Well, on Tisha B'Av, which is the 9th of Av. Av is a month in the Jewish calendar. I believe it's the 6th month, right before the month of Tishrei, which is a very famous month because we have Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, the day of the blasting of the trumpets. So on the 9th of Av, it's a very holy day because that is the day where the first and second temples were destroyed. And there have been other atrocities that happened on that day. So it's a fast day, people pray. And so you had Jews, men and women, worshiping together, fasting in the egalitarian. And again, I've mentioned, we have sadly an extreme element in our society today that is really rejected by much of Orthodox Judaism. And they kind of stormed and overwhelmed this area, and they took it over. And these obviously were all men, and I'm going to guess they were probably younger. They often send the teens because teens can't be arrested at the level that adults can. And these are brainwashed young men who are super zealous, much like the Zealots, 2,000 years ago, which were a radical Jewish group that started a war with Rome and, brought the death of, about 1 million Jews.
Wow.
So these people, again, they're a tiny segment of society. They don't have near the political power that the Zealots had. They were very popular in certain parts of Israel. These guys are not popular, but they're vocal and, and they don't have much opposition because most people, they don't want to deal with, they want to go with their life. They have jobs. They have things to do. So that became a big issue, and the prime minister spoke against it. Other politicians spoke against it. And even 2 Orthodox groups in North America said, this is not us. This is not, we don't agree with this. Even though that we're not conservative or Reform Jews, and we're not real happy about those forms of Judaism, this is wrong. This is violent. This is extremist. So at the same time, on the same day, the 9th of Av, you had about 1,600 Jewish people go up on what's called the Temple Mount. Now, the Temple Mount, there is no more temple. The temple was destroyed 2,000 years ago. Jesus himself prophesied that it would happen, and he said not one stone would be left upon another, and it was completely destroyed. And a lot of people say, well, wait a minute. What about the Western Wall? Isn't that part of the temple? No. The Western Wall was part of a mount, or a box that Herod the Great built. And then on top of that box, he built the temple, the second temple. And so because the temple's completely gone, we just have that wall, and the entire box is still there, but most of it is underground or on the other side towards East Jerusalem. And so that part that is inside the old city of the Western Wall, a few hundred meters, or rather, I think it's like 40 meters, becomes a synagogue, a place of worship. But on top of that, on top of the box, on top of the mount, you have the Dome of the Rock, and you have the Al-Aqsa Mosque up there. And, the Muslims claim that's the 3rd holiest place. To them, it wasn't so important until the Jews began to go back. But that's another issue. Suddenly it became important. Under Turkish rule, it wasn't. It was a mess. It was disregarded, but now it's important again. It is illegal for Jewish people to pray up there. Right? It is, when we took it over, one of the first things that, for good or for bad, that Moshe Dayan did is he said, we are going to work with the Jordanians, and we're not going to, even though we've taken over the West Bank and we've taken over East Jerusalem, we are not going to control the Temple Mount. We're going to let Muslims do that. We're going to let Jordan do that. And so Jordan actually has the legal authority on top of the Temple Mount. And Jews are allowed up there. For a long time we weren't, but Jews are allowed up there right now, but we can't pray. Now, I was up there, Lisa, I'm going to say this about 15 years ago, with a tour group. And I didn't really understand. It was right after Jews suddenly we were allowed to go up there. And I was with a tour group of believers from America and Europe. And we were in a little huddle, and I said to them, I said, listen, we're not allowed to pray up here. They say it's illegal, but I'm telling you right now, as a believer in Yeshua, we are going to pray. We're going to seek God. We're going to do it quietly, but and the tour guide jumped in the middle, and she said, don't do that. And I was like, what? Suddenly all my boldness was gone. She said, they're listening to everything. There are microphones everywhere.
Wow.
And so
wow.
it was also a little bit unsettling up there because there's a tremendous amount of Hamas activism up there. So a lot of green, which is the colors of Islam.
Yep.
And of Hamas. It's a very unsettling place. So when you have 1,600 Jews up there, that suddenly becomes it becomes a political international incident. Now, I wasn't up there. I don't know, what's going on, what was going on, what they were doing. I know that for some Jewish people, just to be up there, to be quiet, that's enough for them. Others are going to be more provocative. But again, this is the most holy place in Judaism. There's nothing more holy than the Temple Mount. And now it is interesting that according to Orthodox Judaism, you're not supposed to go up there. So the fact that these extremists that went up there, and they're all Orthodox Jews, are up there at all is against the ruling of their own rabbis.
Wow.
Or the sages, their own rabbis probably encourage it. But the larger, and the reason is this: the Holy of Holies is up on that mount. They don't know exactly where it is. Now, a lot of people believe it's under the Dome of the Rock, and that's why the Dome of the Rock was built there. But they don't know for sure. And they say you can't go up there because you might accidentally be walking right over the Dome of the Rock, the Holy of Holies. And that would be wrong.
Yeah.
So right now, as you can see, Lisa, and certainly our listeners, there's tremendous anxiety in Israel between different groups of people. You have super left-wing Reform progressive Reform Jews. You've got super right-wing extremists. You've got every kind in the middle. And one of the warnings that kind of came forth and it comes forth every year at this time. So here's what Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said on Facebook: twice we failed and lost our Jewish state. This time we will preserve it. The Jewish people twice had a Jewish state on the land of Israel. And both times we did not succeed to complete the 8th decade as an independent state because of internal wars and sinat chinam. Sinat chinam, it's baseless hatred without a cause. And he's referring to when King David had the land of Israel, and then it was split into two nations under his grandson. And then he's also talking about the time when the Maccabees had independence. It only lasted for 73 years before it was conquered by Pompey of Rome. And so he's saying we can't let that happen again. And when he says sinat chinam, hatred without a cause, it's about internal hatred between Jewish groups. And so it is an issue today in Israel where there is tremendous pressure, anxiety, enmity between different segments of Judaism today. Again, we talk about this every year at this time because of Tisha B'Av, but particularly this year, as we've seen a rise in extremism, it's become an issue.
One last thing to share with our listeners is just, if you can, give us a quick update on how coronavirus and the battle against it there is going. I understand things are getting tense again.
I was rejoicing a few months ago when I said we were down to, or a month ago,
wow.
we were down to 6 cases a day. And this Delta variant has taken Israel by storm. And it is breaking through the vaccine. Now, that's the bad news. Apparently, the vaccine is 64% effective against the new variant, while it was 95% effective against the regular COVID. The good news is that virtually none of the vaccinated people who are getting the Delta variant are showing serious symptoms. They're not being hospitalized. They're not being put on ventilators, and they're not dying. So the vaccine is still working, but it is not keeping everyone from, again, it's 1 out of 3. And it is very contagious from what I understand. We're up to now 1,300 cases a day. They're talking about closing the airport. They're reinstituting the Green Pass. It would appear that this COVID-19 pandemic is going to be with us for a little while longer. I have a good friend who studies trends, and he predicted actually years ago that there would eventually be a pandemic. He thinks it's going to be around, and this guy's a pretty sharp guy with his PhD. He thinks it's going to be around until 2025. So in some way, shape, or form. Way. So if anybody was planning on coming to Israel, joining a tour, it's not going to happen for a while. I'm sorry to inform you all.
Yeah, we'll have to just wait. But maybe up ahead it will clear out again. And I had heard that too. Someone right at the beginning of the pandemic, I forget who it was that I heard, a learned professor type person said they figured it would really take about 5 years to fully pass through the earth and everybody, get through it and all of that. So we'll see, at least there is, the advancements in prevention and treatment and avoidance. And above all, we just keep our eyes on the Lord.
There is some more good news. Israel's found 3 drugs that is very effective in treating coronavirus.
Wonderful.
Now what they've done is our researchers have been going through the catalog of virtually every drug out there that's already made, that's already got FDA approval. And they're testing it on treating COVID. And they've come up with 3 that are very effective. The good news is this, and again, I am not a conspiracy theorist. I do know that the devil is conspiring against God, but all the other stuff I just ignore. And even if it's true, I'm not worried about it. I'm focused on preaching the gospel. I'm focused, Shalano TV, sharing the good news of Yeshua with my people. That's where our focus needs to be. You don't need to worry about Bill Gates. God can take care of him. You don't need to worry about all the different conspiracies. And much of them are just silly. The focus needs to be on winning people to Yeshua. So, there are breakthroughs. I don't know how I got to that. We were talking about the breakthroughs in terms of the drugs. I'm saying this is what I started to say, is that even though in the beginning COVID was very deadly, more and more, we're now almost 2 years into it. By the end of this year, it'll be 2 years. And doctors are learning how to treat it. I chose to get the vaccine, and I'm very glad that I made that decision. But people, there are more and more treatments becoming available to help folks to stay alive.
Good news. Well, thank you, Ron, for all that. We covered a lot of territory, but I think it was all really good. It was a good walk through history and the power of words, and we started off with ice cream. So there you have it. So that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Israel Insider Podcast. And if our listeners, if you enjoyed this weekly podcast, then please be sure to give it a review so others can find it wherever you're listening to it from whatever platform. And be sure to follow the Israel Insider on Facebook and sign up for our daily email to get the inside scoop on happenings in the Holy Land. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next week.